Today we come to domain 3 of CCSP, which is cloud platform and infrastructure security. This and the next domain is one of the most important domains of CCSP. And on certain points of this domain, I would also recommend you guys to go through the domain 1 of the CISSP, which is security operations, because you will get a lot of clarity on certain concept on this domain. So the key points what we are going to cover on this is what is cloud infrastructure components, what is the risk associated to the cloud infrastructure, design and plan of security control, and the disaster recovery and business continuity. This is a new addition which has come from 2019. So on a cloud platform and infrastructure, as I have explained in our first class, cloud is formed of the physical infrastructure to give services to the multiple customers. So when a cloud platform is created by any organization, it has its own physical environment, same like your private data center, same like your private cloud. So it has got the physical data center, it has got the physical cooling units, it has got the physical network racks, it has got the physical generator backup, the raised floors, the racks, everything. And it is connected to the world using the network and communication. So all those components which are part of your physical data center are part of the cloud platform security. Okay, so infrastructure on cloud is same, and the major difference between your on-premise data center and cloud environment is multi-tenancy. Because on your on-premise, you are the only user of your environment. On cloud, there are thousands or millions of users who are connected. So that is a major difference. What is there? Okay, and how it is controlled. So in domain 2, we saw no, on-premise cannot be multi-tenancy, because on-premise is what? On-premise is normally your own data center. So if you are not renting your services to others, how it can be multi-tenancy? It will be used only by your company. And if you are allowing a multi-tenancy on that, then you are offering the cloud services. When you are using the virtual machines or containers, for what you are using? So here, if you see, the virtualization is already there. Okay, so when you do virtualization on a private cloud, you are doing it for your personal use. You are not using the virtualization for the purpose of giving services to the multiple tenants. So that is where I am saying that on premise and cloud, the only difference is multi-tenancy, because on premise you do not have more than one tenants who are using your services. On premise is normally used only by the organization for which the data center is constructed. So that is not a multi-tenancy. If you are referring to the managed services or a co-location services, then that is different, because there again you are either renting a hardware or you are hosting your own hardware. So that is different than cloud. So managed services is different. In managed services, like cloud, the same hardware is not shared by the multiple tenants. Your hardware is always isolated. So managed services is different. So in cloud infra, what you have is a physical data center, which I already mentioned. So on a physical environment, so you have the raised floor. Okay, you have network, you have the servers. So if you see all these things are there. So what gives a orchestration layer on this is the management plane. So all your physical devices, your compute, your VM environment, your storage is connected using a management plane on this. And how you control is through the orchestration there. Okay, and security of all these components plays a vital role. Now, how you design a secure data center? So there are two things. One is the logical design and one is the physical design. Now, before we get into the logical design, let's quickly have again a discussion on a physical design. So when you are designing a data center, you have to, and when you want to provide the services on cloud for the multiple tenants, your secure design plays a very vital role. So everything has to be redundant. So redundancy plays a vital role because you are providing the services for the multiple people. So your entrance to the facility, your network points, your power backups, your cooling for the facility, okay, your the distribution points for the power, then your compute devices, your switches, your storage devices, everything physically has to be designed in a way where redundancy is at the center, because that is the most important thing to give the availability assurance to the customer. Now when you are doing this, when say AWS or Microsoft or Google are selecting the locations for their data center to add in their regions, what they do is they select the area where all these things on a redundancy are available. So they make sure that they have the power from two different sources, they have internet from the two different sources, they have the generator backup there, they have the cooling on a different cooling units, they have even the fuel availability, that the area is not covered under any threat or a vulnerability zone, like it's not prone to any natural disaster or floods. So all these physical survey is done before any data center is created by a cloud provider. When you have a physical environment designed, then you get into a logical design of the data center. Now in logical design, what happens is whatever you have designed physically, you have a virtual layer which gives you the functionality to have a logical segregation or a partitioning for each tenant, because whatever services here we are discussing, including compute, storage, network, everything has to be segregated for each tenant in a transparent way. So the logical designs comes into the picture once your physical design is already done and implemented. And for environmental design, there is a Uptime Institute standard which defines, like there are 4 tiers on availability. So normally, which tier cloud infrastructure or a cloud provider's facility falls is either it is on a tier 3 or a tier 4, based on the redundancy created by them. Okay, now these factors also define, like what kind of a cooling you maintain in a data center. So if you see any data center, when you are having it on premise or you are maintaining a cloud data center, the temperature should be maintained anywhere between 18 to 27 degrees. That is defined by the standard. So if your temperature doesn't fall between that, then there is a problem which you have to look into. These all factors are covered. Then we go on what is your network communication in cloud, how you define your different network functionalities, how you have a network layer virtualized, how you define the access control, how you have the bandwidth allocation for each your customer, how you limit the rates, how the routing is done. So all these factors which are related to a software virtualization are normally covered with a concept called software defined network, and it's very important topic which is highly testable in exam. So do not miss this in a software defined network, because this is like a management layer of the physical network implemented in the cloud data center. So what happens is, as a end user or as an application layer, you have a management plane which helps you to define your own IP addresses, your own routing, your own security groups. Everything can be defined using the software defined network. For that management plane, you have a second layer of the control plane, where the management plane gives the API based instructions, and the actual routing of your IP addresses and security groups is done. And then this control plane is in turn connected to the data plane, which is a physical layer of your network devices. So your physical switches are connected to the control plane, and control plane in turn is connected to the management plane, and it gets into a software defined network. It is a very important concept of the cloud data center, and it's completely testable. So you need to make sure that you are aware about it. And when you have the software defined network, then we get into the next part, where you have your compute or your workload, which is virtualized. So it is, what is your compute normally? It's either part of a virtual machine or a container which you get to host your application. And in that, now there are three important concepts which I want you guys to note down: is reservation. So it is reservation, then limit, and share. So what is reservation? So reservation is that you are reserving, or you are taking a guarantee from a cloud provider that you will get a minimum resource allocation come what may. So you say, if you are hosting your application and you say that, okay, I am getting server, a virtual server, and I want at least 4 CPUs and say 500 GB of RAM to be allocated to me. Maybe you are right now using say 2 CPUs and maybe 100 GB of RAM. But then with the reservation, it's a minimum guarantee for you that you will always get 4 CPUs and 500 GB of RAM. Okay. Then limit is what you get as maximum. So if you have not selected, or you have just gone for a reservation, then what maximum as a limit, what you will get is, you will get 4 CPUs and 500 GB of RAM. You will not get any resource beyond that, because that is what is available. And the last concept is share. So it is to manage the issues with the computer resources during situation where you have a limitation. So what happens is, when you are having a lots of requests coming to a cloud provider, and there is maybe for unforeseen scenario, if there is any limit on availability of resources, then the priority is given to the customers who are making the requests in a sequence. So that is called share. So if you have not booked anything as a reservation, the priority will come to you as a share. So this is very important and a testable fundamental on the cloud. Then when you go on virtualization, as I have already covered in domain 1, please make a note that virtualization is normally done with type 1 and type 2. and there is a definite question on that, which is the safe virtualization type. Is it type 1 or type 2? Okay. Then we again come to the most important part of management plane. Please make a note that management plane is the only part on cloud which is not having any redundancy from a customer perspective. So if you have an issue in logging in on your management plane, then you lose the access to your cloud environment. So management plane is the only interface which takes you to your cloud environment, and inside that, on a logical and on a physical way, everything is redundant. So management plane security is the most tricky part, and it's a most powerful tool. It integrates the authentication, access control. It is used for logging, monitoring, for your resources used, your billing, everything. So it's a very critical and important factor that you have a proper security done for your management plane. Okay, when you have your management thing and you are hosting your environment in cloud, it is imperative that you need to safeguard it from the cloud computing risks. For this also, I will again recommend that go through the domain 1 of CISSP, where the risk management factors are explained in a detailed way. Because ultimately, as I have also explained on data, the cloud customer is responsible for its own risk assessment in coordination with the cloud service provider. So for data, it's only cloud customer, but for the risk assessment, the cloud customer has to coordinate with the cloud service provider to do the risk assessment. And for that, the organization need to have their own policies for the organization of risk, identification of risk, and the management of risk. And then normally, if you are getting into, like, what are your general risks on the cloud computing? Like, single point of failure. If you are required more skills from a CSP for a larger platform, your technical knowledge on cloud. These are the generic risks which people face on cloud. But if you go in your physical data center and then you go on a cloud, your virtualization risks are similar. Like, you have a risk of guest escape, which is important from an exam perspective. Like, your hypervisor is compromised and the outsider can now access your guest OS from one OS to other OS. It's called guest escape. It's highly testable. Then you have a concept called VM sprawl. VM sprawl is that you keep on creating machines where your virtual environment is out of control. You cannot manage your virtual environment anywhere. So that is called VM sprawl. It's again highly testable. Okay. So as I have mentioned, like, management plane breach. So if your management plane is compromised, your entire environment is compromised. It's very important that you safeguard your management plane. From a cloud service provider perspective, if their resources are exhausted, it's a biggest risk. If they are not maintaining the enough spare pool, it's another risk what they have. So these are the points which you should note from the risk management perspective. There are certain risks which are not cloud specific or a cloud provider specific, which is like natural disaster or unauthorized access to the campus switch. On a natural disaster, I just based it on when you are selecting the location for the data center. So when you are selecting a physical location to have a cloud centric data center, you need to make sure that the place what you have selected is not prone to any natural disaster. Like, it is not near to any earthquake centric zone, or it is not flood prone area, or it does not have any like a riot or a communal disorder kind of a risks there. So all those things you have to take care. Also, on a cloud security, you also need to take care of legal risks. And these are mainly related to your data protection and the jurisdiction where you are storing your data, the licensing, like, if you are taking the on-premise license to cloud, you need to verify, like, if you are using Oracle as a database, then the licensing policy for a virtual database and a physical database is different. So when you are using these kind of things, you need to be very, very clear that all these things are checked and they are addressed when you are moving to cloud. So there are again cloud specific different attack vectors also. So that also has to be considered, and like micro segmentation from a cloud service provider perspective has to be taken care of. So physical environment protection is quite important from a data center security perspective. And for that, when physical design is done, normally all these data centers which are used for the cloud service, there is an ISO standard which is 22,237. So 22237 is a ISO standard which is used to get the data center certified from a service provider perspective, and it helps the cloud service provider to define the required policies and procedures for the safe work and the environment, physical and access to the information assets, and physical security perimeter for the data center. And when you are doing a physical security, again, your external factors, your redundancy, your power substations, generator, your fuel tank for the generator, the placement of the fuel tank, your network service providers, the building access points, these all things has to be considered. Okay. So we have discussed a majority of these attack vectors already, like what is the guest breakout. There is an identity compromise which can happen. Okay, on identity compromise, it is like, if my username and password is compromised and someone else is logging in as Sujay, then there is identity compromise. Okay, and that is one of the lethal risk which is there on any cloud thing. So that's where, the root account of your cloud control plane should not be used for your day-to-day cloud operation. So that's where your root account should always be isolated, where your billing information and all is stored. It should not be shared with anyone, and other admin users or other people who are doing various operations on your cloud management plane should be given their individual user IDs. Then API compromise is another very common thing if your API is not having a secured key-based access. So if your API is not secured and API is compromised, then again your environment can be accessed by the intruders. Now, if the cloud service provider is not having a proper security from the network perspective and also the physical environment perspective, then there is a threat of having the attack on the service provider's environment. And if there is a compromise on that environment, in turn, the multiple tenants who are hosting their applications with the cloud service provider will have that threat. So that is where the physical and the logical security of assets of the environment of the network is important from a cloud service provider perspective. Okay, so even that attack can come from an internet service provider also. And for the countermeasure, it is defense in depth. So for a physical thing, normally a perimeter security having the multiple gates, the man trap kind of access for the data center. So if you go for any cloud data center, you will not see lots of people having access to the actual data center area. It's very highly secured and restricted access. You can even on a YouTube, you can put a search on Google data center security. You will have 2 3 different videos where you can get a feel that how the Google data center is secured from any access perspective, and how people are having access to the racks, how they are segregated. Like if a person is a storage person, then he will not have access to the area where the compute is there. So you can just go through that YouTube video, which explains that how the defense in depth is taken care of, right from your vehicle entering the premise to the employee actually getting into the physical data center. How the resiliency and redundancy should be which is the most important factor to make sure your services are made available always. Maximum automation of the control is the key for your success of cloud service. Maximum automation is required to eliminate the manual intervention, which can be obstructing the security and leading to the threats of compromise. So that is where API automation is a key on cloud. Then the physical and logical access controls. Okay, physical environment protection, which we have already discussed, and especially the CCTV and access control devices play a very vital role. And then the regulatory controls, which are required from a jurisdictional perspective or a geographical perspective, that should be taken care. So this again, I'm repeating this to give you a feel that in each model, how the security is taken care of. So if you see the first thing on an infrastructure or as a cloud, only physical security is responsibility of a cloud service provider. The infrastructure security is a shared responsibility. Why? Because when you are using infrastructure as a cloud, you are having your own operating system, you are defining your own IP ranges, you are having your own security groups, that is a firewall. So the infrastructure security is the shared responsibility in infrastructure as a service. Then platform, application, data, and the governance thing is entirely to be managed by the cloud customer. Then when you go on platform, the infra and physical becomes responsibility of a cloud service provider. The platform security becomes the responsibility of cloud customer and cloud service provider as shared, and rest becomes the cloud customer's responsibility. And in software as a service, as everything is managed by the cloud service provider, so up to platform, it's his responsibility. As application access is defined by the end customer, it is a shared responsibility, and the data and compliance becomes the responsibility of a customer. Okay, so how do you manage the cloud computing risks? Okay, now when you are having virtualization in domain 4, we will cover the connectivity concept in detail, but how you manage this access and connectivity is through the protocols like OAuth or SAML, the secure assertion and management thing. That is something these protocols help you to have the seamless integration with your maybe Active Directory or your authentication platform to have access to the cloud environment. Okay, and these all you can define on the management plane. It's a very important thing, and then when you are defining this, you can also have your SIEM solution implemented. You can do the cloud orchestration through this, and the most important thing on this becomes that your APIs should be secured and have a very stringent access. So this will help you to have your own logging. You should have a capacity of isolating your environment. You should have a IDS and IPS, that is intrusion detection and prevention tool implemented. You should have your confidentiality trust zone. You should also implement the multi-factor authentication, especially for admins, where it's very critical on the management plane that you should not have the single factor authentication to avoid the compromise on the management plane access. Okay, then you should have a proper auditing mechanism also implemented, so that a regular audits of your environment will help you to understand if there are any breaches on the cloud thing. Okay, so this takes us to the most important topic of business continuity planning and disaster recovery. As we are aware that business continuity planning is most important factor from any business perspective, and when you are deploying it from the cloud perspective, it has got a small difference, and we will have to understand how it will work in a different scenarios. So now, to start with, at many organizations in a current scenario, the first step what is taken as your physical data center remains on premise, and the business starts using cloud for their disaster recovery site. Okay, so your physical data center remains as is, and as a DR you have your replication done on any cloud, which can be AWS, which can be Azure, which can be Google, or any other cloud. Okay, so what happens, any incident has taken place on your physical on-premise data center, your DR site on cloud becomes primary, and your user starts accessing the DR. In today's time, that is pay as you go. So it's a most cheapest option available for businesses, rather than subscribing for the physical DR at a different location, or using a managed services to host your devices and pay the AMC for that. It is called DR on demand, which is the most common thing in today's world, which many people are utilizing as a first step of their migration to the cloud. Now the second option which you can see here is, you use the same cloud provider DR somewhere else. You have the cloud service provider, say in region A, and you have your DR replicated on region B. Sometimes what happens is that few people, instead of creating a DR, they take advantage of a native feature of cloud, where your data is by default distributed in multiple availability zones within same region. So few people don't opt for a DR. But if you want to go for a DR, and if you are having your data hosted in India zone, you can select maybe Middle East or Ireland as your DR zone. So your data is default replicated in another zone, and something goes wrong in India, that is Mumbai zone. You can, this region goes down, your data will be available from a different region. That is another type of use of DR on cloud. And the third type is that when you are having, say, your primary is hosted on AWS, and you want redundancy to be taken care, you can have your DR on Azure. That's another way of having your disaster recovery. So if failure happens, your restoration happens on Azure. Okay, and for this planning, normally the cloud service provider and the cloud customer, they refer to the ISO standard 27031. Okay, and cloud by default has a resilient infrastructure. So many a times, if you are opting as option one or option two, where you are on premise and your DR is on cloud, or you are on cloud already and you are using multiple regions as your primary and DR site. That is something which is very common these days. There are few people where the application is already portable and interoperability is tested. They also use two different cloud providers. Okay. So when you are forming your business continuity and DR strategy, it is very important for you to consider the alternate solution for each account from a continuity perspective. Because if you are selecting a partial thing, then in case of disaster, you will not have a complete security for your environment. It is very important. And you have to select the location in a way where, if you are currently, say, having your primary location in Mumbai, you cannot have your DR also in Mumbai, because if the disaster is hitting Mumbai, then your primary and DR both sites will get affected. And that is where, from a cloud perspective, it is always said that if you are having one region selected, at least you host your DR in a different region. Even if you are selecting a different cloud provider as your DR site, then do not select the same region. So for example, if your primary is in AWS in Mumbai region, and you are selecting Azure as your DR, then select a different region of Azure. Because if it is a natural calamity, then it can have an impact on both the service providers. So it is also recommended that you take care of a selection of location in a wise way. Okay. When your data is getting replicated, there are certain things from a replication perspective on DR, that how much time you are going to take to do your replication. Like, your data, what is the size, how much time it will take to replicate data from one location to other. What is the recovery point objective you are looking at? Because if your data is in big size and if you are doing a replication from, say, on premise to cloud, and there is a lag in replication, will it match your recovery point objective? Because if the disaster happens and if your 4 hours data is not replicated on cloud and your recovery point objective is 2 hours, then you are not achieving the disaster recovery site objective. So you have to be careful. Also, when you are selecting the type of replication, you also have to be careful on the legal requirements on geographical selection of your data. So geographical, if your legal requirement is that data cannot go outside India, you cannot have your DR outside India. So this also you have to be very careful when the DR site is getting selected. Okay. And your replication strategies on data time replication, use of bandwidth, possibility of data corruption has to be taken care. Okay. Then we have to select the wise functionality of replication, which we are already discussing, because it will have multiple impacts. And in SaaS, you might have to select directly a different CSP. You will not have a choice, because when you are using software as a service, you will not have any control on where the data is getting hosted. So from there, if you want a DR subscription, maybe you will have to go for a different cloud provider itself. Okay. So when you are preparing your business continuity and a disaster recovery, you also need to have a plan to be prepared, which should have a detailed scope. So what are the applications you want to cover? What are the services you want to cover? What is the scope of those services? So you have to define what is your recovery time objective, what is your recovery point objective, what is your minimum tolerable downtime you are looking at. I hope that you guys are all aware about these terminologies. If not, I will again recommend that you go through the CISSP CBK for the detailed explanation on this, or when the full length batch of CCSP is taken, this will be explained in detail. Then you have to also gather the requirements related to the these DR context. Like, what are your critical business functions? What are the critical assets you need to safeguard? What is the plan for which you are working on this? Like, you want the plan to be approved by the management. So what risks you want to address during this? What risks you want to accept from the risk assessment perspective? Then when you are designing your plan, what are your objectives? What are the timelines you want to achieve? What is the technical evaluation you need to do? Okay, so these all to be addressed when you are planning for this. And most important thing, from an exam perspective, there is a definite exam question that if you are having a business continuity plan, what is a duration or what is a frequency in which you should test it? Okay, so there are multiple ways people do it. Some people test it maybe quarterly, some people test it on a need basis. But if you are having a BCP as a process, you should have a test at least once in a year. So minimum annual test is something which is mandatory. Then when if you are doing this, you should have a various ways which you have to agree for your DR drill or your BCP test. So if you are having a plan, there are different ways, which is like checklist review, tabletop exercise, or a walkthrough. Okay, a drill or a simulation test. Okay, or a full-fledged testing, like a parallel testing or full-fledged movement of DR to the secondary site. Okay, so these all things has to be planned, and the proper test has to be done on a agreed interval. So if you are agreeing an annual interval, then you should test it on an annual basis. Okay, I have discussed you should have a detailed scope. What is your purpose? Why you are doing this? What do you want to achieve? All these things has to be defined in a detailed way. Okay, and you should address the risks which are related to the business continuity and a disaster recovery. So what are the risks we are talking about? That what is your architecture on a disaster recovery? It should not be complicated. It should match your production site. Okay, your failover testing should have a proper planning, because if you are moving to a disaster recovery, how are you going to roll back to the production? Those things are quite important to be documented in a detailed way. So these points needs to be covered in a detailed way in your business continuity and disaster plan. Is it clear? Okay, so when we have discussed these things, the important topics from this domain perspective are the terminology which is used in BCDR, which is, I have already explained what is your RPO, that is recovery point objective. What is your RTO, that is recovery time objective. What is MTD? What is a single loss expectancy? What is annual loss expectancy? These all things you need to understand in a detailed way. There is a possibility. I have not seen many questions like CISSP, but in CCSP, there is a possibility that they might ask you to calculate the SLE. I've not really seen that many times, but there is a possibility. And for that, you can refer the CISSP syllabus. Then the virtualization risks, which we have discussed, like how you will isolate the VM within the same hypervisor. What are the different risks, like what is VM sprawl? What are the inter VM attacks? What are the SDN related attacks? Okay, these are important things which you need to cover from the BCDR perspective. So from a domain perspective, I've covered this topic. Okay, so this is the first question for domain 3. So the answer for this question is C. use another cloud provider for the BCDR backup. Okay, let's go to question 2. This is a tricky question, and answer to this question is good cryptographic key management. See, on a cloud, if you are having your BCDR, you will never have access to the server where the backup is stored. Many of the times, you will not know where actually this is stored. You remember we discussed about this, that when you are having your region selected and your availability zones selected, you will not have any information about storage of your data, where physically it is stored. So it's not possible that you will have access to the servers. You will have access to your data. Okay. And when you are storing something, what is significant consideration is that you have a good cryptographic key management to make sure that your backup is secured. So that should be your most important consideration. Okay. Let's go to next question. On this question, the correct answer is A. I think it is pretty straightforward. I don't think this is a complicated question. Let's move to next question. So this is again a very simple question, and it's administrative offices which does not fall under the redundancies category. Let's go to next question. This is again a pretty straightforward and answer is correct. Let's go to next question. So this is specifically a question which I had in my actual exam of CCSP. Let's go to the next question. I think this is a primary standard question for you guys. The correct answer is C. Next question. The correct answer is reservations. This is very important concept which I'm again reminding you guys that there is a guaranteed question on this in a more difficult way. This question is very straightforward and simple, but there's a guaranteed question on the reservation shares and limits. So as a concept, you need to understand this. Next question. Type 2 hypervisor, which is not used at a professional level or a corporate level. It's mainly used on the personal thing where you are using the hypervisor installed on OS, which is more prone to the attacks. Okay, and the last question for today, and the correct answer here is the cloud provider. I think all of you are, looks like you guys are well prepared, or the questions are very simple. So this brings us to the end of today's session. I hope it was informative.